Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Look, before I get into this morning's video, I want to remind you, Preterist Pilgrim Weekend 2019, Ardmore, Oklahoma. Our theme is How to Know We're Not Living in the Last Days. What a comfort. I mean, after all, there is no man of sin. There is no abomination of desolation. There is no great tribulation in our future. Earth's not going to burn up at the coming out of heaven of a 5'5" Jewish man riding a cumulus cloud. Okay? That's not a biblical doctrine. Well, anyway, we're looking at Matthew chapter 24 and verse 3, where the disciples asked Jesus, when he said concerning the temple, "Do you not see all these things? The time is coming in which not one stone shall be left standing on top of another." I mean, that was stunning. It was frightening. The implications of that were beyond belief. And I've shared with you how important that temple was to the Jews of the ancient world. How we today simply cannot grasp the incredible theological and soteriological significance they placed on that temple. And how ridiculous it is, therefore, when modern-day Bible students try to negate, depreciate the significance of Jesus' prediction of that temple. I mean, after all, the thinking seems to be, well, I don't think temples are all that big a deal. Why would they? It's because we're not Jews and because the temple was not the center of our world like it was theirs. Well, anyway, in yesterday's video, I posed the following. When the disciples asked Jesus for a sign of his parousia, his coming and the end of the age, did they, as John Calvin claimed, automatically think of the end of time? Were they incapable of believing that the temple could be destroyed without it being at the end of the Christian age? We'll have more to say about that later. Or were the disciples aware that that temple, not that temple, but the first temple, were they aware that the temple had been destroyed in 586 BC? Of course they were. Were they aware that that destruction in 586 BC was the destruction of heaven and earth? Yes, they were. Were they aware that that destruction was called the day of the Lord? Yes, they were. In the theological environment in which I was raised, I was taught that the term day of the Lord, coming of the Lord, second coming, most especially day of the Lord, coming of the Lord, had to refer to one event and one event only. The end of time, the end of the Christian age. Some years ago, many years ago now, as I began to investigate Matthew chapter 24, realizing that Jesus was a Jew, the disciples were Jews, and that temple was the heartbeat of their nation, the heartbeat of their world, I began to ask myself the question, well, what about this terminology of the coming of the Lord, day of the Lord, parousia? Are those Old Testament concepts? Let's remember that Jesus said, "Do not think that I am come to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill." So Jesus' mission was to fulfill the Old Covenant. That meant the Old Covenant was everything to him. That meant that his ministry was based on the Old Covenant. So as I began to ponder those truths, I began to ask myself the question whether or not the fall of Jerusalem in 586 had any connection with the terminology of day of the Lord. I began to ask myself the question, if the language of the destruction of heaven and earth, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 35, might have precedent in the Old Testament, in the Old Testament language of the day of the Lord. And I have to tell you, it was stunning to me, challenging to me, to come to realize that the Old Testament uses the terminology of the destruction of heaven and earth, the language of the Parousia, if you please, the coming of the Lord, the day of the Lord, to refer not only to the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, but that language was used to describe the fall of Babylon, Isaiah chapter 13, the fall of Egypt, Isaiah chapter 19. We'll talk about all of these more. But again, I was stunned to realize that all of the language, every bit of the language that I had traditionally assumed had to refer to the so-called end of time, found its precedent in the Old Testament in passages that had nothing to do with an end of time. Now, let's go to Jeremiah chapter 4. Jeremiah chapter 4 is just one of many predictions in the book of Jeremiah of the impending destruction of Jerusalem in BC 586. Notice what Yahweh said. Jeremiah chapter 4. Declare in Judah, proclaim in Jerusalem. Okay, where's this message for? Who's this message for? Blow the trumpet in the land, cry, gather together, and say, assemble yourselves, let us go into the fortified cities and set up the standard toward Zion. Take refuge, do not delay, for I will bring disaster from the north and great destruction. Okay, what do we find here? The sounding of the trumpet, the gathering, and the language of eminence. You know, it's absolutely ridiculous. I want to be as kind as possible here, but it's absolutely ridiculous when people try to nullify God's inspired time statements. Oh, time doesn't mean anything with God. Well, I wonder then, do not delay. Well, it doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean a thing. No. Doesn't mean one thing. After all, God doesn't think in time like we do. So when he told them, don't delay, gather together, sound the trumpet, sound the alarm, they didn't have to worry about that. Okay, to continue. Verse 13. Behold, he, that's Yahweh, shall come up like clouds. Actually, that's Nebuchadnezzar, excuse me. He shall come up like clouds, his chariots like whirlwind. The horses are swifter than eagles. Woe to us, for we are plundered. Do you see the imagery of clouds and dust and whirlwind? To refer to the coming of Nebuchadnezzar. But guess what? The coming of Nebuchadnezzar was to be the day of the Lord. Prove that later. Now watch this. Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23. As Jeremiah contemplated what was about to happen, he prophetically said, I beheld the earth, and indeed it was without form and void. The heavens, they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and indeed they trembled, and all the hills moved back and forth. I beheld, and there was no man. All the birds of the heavens had fled. I beheld, and indeed the fruitful land was a wilderness. All of its cities were broken down. Now watch this. At the presence of the Lord by his fierce anger. Now the word presence here is from the Greek word prosopon. Prosopon means face. It is presence, therefore, and is strongly associated with parousia, which means presence. So what do we find in Jeremiah? In Jeremiah chapter 4, we have the sounding of the trumpet for the impending day of the Lord. In Jeremiah, we have the coming of Nebuchadnezzar in fire, with his chariots, with the clouds of dust. And we have heaven and earth being destroyed at the presence of the Lord. Oh, and it was coming shortly without delay. The disciples knew that had happened, didn't they? The disciples were aware of this language of heaven and earth being destroyed, weren't they? The disciples were aware of the meaning of the sounding of the trumpet at the impending invasion, weren't they? They were aware of the language of coming on the clouds and the dust and the fire, weren't they? Of course they were. And yet we're being asked to believe. No, commentators basically insist that we believe that when Jesus predicted the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, the disciples didn't think for even one moment of the previous fall of Jerusalem in BC 586. That was the day of the Lord that came quickly, just as God said. And it was the destruction of heaven and earth at the presence, prosopon, of the Lord. Nah, they'd have never thought about any of that. You see how silly that is? They would ignore their entire history. They would ignore their entire prophetic scriptures. They would ignore their entire history. Because after all, the commentators tell us they could not imagine the fall of Jerusalem of their day, that temple, being destroyed unless it was at the end of time. Now look, we haven't even touched the hem of the garment, to be real. And so tomorrow I will continue showing you from the scriptures where the fall of Jerusalem in BC 586 was called the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord's wrath. I will show you where God had said it was at hand, it was coming soon, it was to come shortly, quickly, without delay. And by the way, God could tell time when He said that. God spoke truthfully when He said that. And therefore, any and all arguments about God not talking about time like man does are completely, totally specious and false. They are, in a word, ridiculous. Which sort of kind of means that when people scoff, literally scoff, at the 100 plus time statements of the imminence of the day of the Lord in the first century, they are denying God Himself. Don't forget to go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and order a copy of my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, in which I document the use of all of this kind of apocalyptic language and how it was the vernacular of the day to describe any time God acted sovereignty in history to use this nation to judge that nation. That was how Jesus used the language. That's how the disciples understood the language. And that means they were not asking about an end of time, earth-burning coming of the Lord. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Order this book. Be sure to include a note that says you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping. Okay, tomorrow I will continue to share with you the Old Testament prophecies of the BC 586 day of the Lord and how the language that was used of that destruction is the exact language used by the New Testament writers to speak of the AD 70 judgment on Jerusalem. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you on the flip side.